Hi, welcome to Featured Favorites, a little program out of the Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library from the Theosophical Society in America here in Wheaton, Illinois. I'm Dan Smola, librarian at the Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library. And my very special guest today is my friend Pete Harris.
Hello.
Hello. Pete, let's start out by counting backwards. Let's start out by you telling us how long. It seems like ever since I've been working at the library, it's about 5 years for me. You've been here been coming here at least that long, and maybe longer.
Well, actually, I moved out to Wheaton when I was 18, 17, and I discovered the Quest Bookshop not too long after that, and then the Theosophical Society many years later. I was actually I wish I had known about the Theosophical Society. I never made it down the road, actually.
Right.
But I was a frequent visitor at the Quest Bookshop from my 17th year to present.
So this is going back to the late 50s then?
Some would think that, yes.
I'm sorry. I'm just joking. Same age as me.
No, actually 1979.
Okay. So quite a while, and so obviously you've been interested in, for lack of a better phrase, esoteric spirituality for quite a while. And I know, just from me being a librarian, not to invade your privacy, but that you are interested in just about every subject that we cover in this library, which is a lot. And just a little bit more background. Last year in our featured live program series, Thursday night programs, you gave a lecture, and it was on shamanism. The exact title,
I could not even tell you.
But it was on shamanism, based on your own personal experiences.
Right.
Very well attended. And
I went down to Peru and studied with a couple shamans for a couple weeks, and learned a lot about shamanism, how it's currently taught in Peru, but also learned a little bit about how shamanism is changing as a result of Western culture being so interested in it. And so it was enlightening and disappointing at the same time, because I could see how our presence was changing things down there, and they were trying to cater to us, where I was really more interested in the actual indigenous practices that were taught in the cultures. So it definitely was worth time, energy, and money, but I don't think I would go back.
But one interesting result of it, as you've told me, and as you covered in your lecture, that sort of exotic journey to the other world catapulted you into kind of coming back home, as it were, spiritually, and kind of
in several ways,
re-exploring the Western traditions, right?
Yeah, I think you'll see a little bit of that today when I talk about a couple of the books. Very early on, I was just interested in shamanism. Then I moved away and studied Buddhism, and actually practiced Buddhism, Zen Buddhism for several years. But I then moved away from that, but came back, got interested in shamanism again, and then upon my return from Peru, actually there was an experience I had in Peru that basically said, you really have to explore Western esotericism. Yeah. So since my return in 2007, that's where my focus has been.
Okay.
And included in that, although some people would not put theosophy in that camp, I definitely think it has its roots there. Okay.
And all right, so, and I know you had to really work on narrowing down your list today. Featured favorites, if you happen to be new to this little program, is where we ask people to choose books from our library here, the Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library, that they've really enjoyed. So I know you really had to narrow down your list.
Yeah, it's really hard. I really don't have... I have some favorite books, and a couple today are my favorite. Not so much because I read them every year, or they are continue to be an inspiration to me. But when I read them at the time, they did have a big impact on me.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really going to be talking about today.
Okay, so let's jump in.
All right. The first book I came across, this was the Teachings of Don Juan.
Okay.
And by Carlos Castaneda. It was the summer before I went to college. So I was 18. I was working a summer job, but I had a lot of time off. So I was reading. I must read about a book or two a week, even to this day.
Right.
So when I read Carlos Castaneda, I was totally floored by what I found. It was totally foreign to me, but very exciting.
Yeah.
And what led up to me picking Don Juan, the Teachings of Don Juan, up out of the bookstore, buying it, was was reading a book called The Crack in the Cosmic Egg.
Okay.
Challenging Constructs of Mind and Reality.
Joseph Chilton Pearce. Sorry, you were going to say that.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was interested in, I had an excellent psychology teacher in high school, and he introduced me to hypnotism, meditation, dreams, psychedelic drug states. Not that he provided these things, but he just basically taught us about altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
And for a young mind like that, it really opened new vistas for me. So I was reading voraciously on these topics, and I picked up The Crack in the Cosmic Egg, and this book talks a lot about the teachings of Don Juan.
Oh, okay.
And he actually compares Don Juan to Jesus in this book. And he also talks about how Don Juan perceived reality. And the way that Don Juan perceived reality was totally new to me. And I have a little quote here of how Don Juan perceives it. Don Juan recognizes the ordinary world to be but one of an endless number of possible constructs. The man of courage and daring in his culture will explore as many possibilities of this as he can, simply because the possibilities are there, and that is what life is about. Man can restructure reality in a freely synthesized way. Although death is the final victor, to live a strong, hard life in which reality opens its endless possibilities is the mark of a warrior, a man of knowledge, and the only conceivable way to live.
Would you read just the very last part? To lead a...
Let's see. Though death is the final victor, to live a strong, hard life in which reality opens its endless possibility is the mark of a warrior, a man of knowledge, and the only conceivable way to live.
Okay. Very well written.
So I read this. I ran out and bought the Teachings of Don Juan. I probably read it in 2 or 3 days.
So you were like 18?
Yes, I was 18.
Okay.
And I read that one, and then I read the next 4 in the series that were out at the time. So from Separate Reality all the way up to... I think it's the 2 Rings of Power, or I can't remember.
So
what
just
it is.
in case somebody is not familiar with Don Juan,
well, let me just jump right into that.
Okay.
So, what is Don Juan about? So Carlos Castaneda was a student at the University of California in Los Angeles, studying cultural anthropology. And he was also very interested in shamans. So this is actually the opening paragraph to the book. In the summer of 1960, while I was an anthropology student at the University of California, Los Angeles, I made several trips to the Southwest to collect information on medicinal plants used by Indians of the area. The events I describe here began during one of my trips. I was waiting in a border town for a Greyhound bus, talking with a friend who had been a guide and helper in the survey. Suddenly, he leaned toward me and whispered that a man, a white-haired old Indian who was sitting in front of the window, was very learned about plants, especially peyote. I asked my friend to introduce me to this man. So the man that Carlos met was Don Juan. And Don Juan took him as an apprentice and taught him how to use psychedelic drugs in order to see all these separate realities, all these different non-ordinary realities. And Carlos wrote 4 books about Don Juan until Don Juan left the picture. I don't want to ruin it for anybody who may be interested in it, but he leaves, and then Carlos joins several other apprentices of Don Juan, and they continue the work that Don Juan had started.
But there's, in those books, there's a lot of sort of mystical, psychological insights too, right? I mean, it's not just let's get on the psychedelic painted desert
right.
bus.
I mean, basically, what Don Juan was trying to teach Carlos is that whether it's psychedelic drugs or through lucid dream states or other types of trance techniques that Don Juan would teach him, you can enter these non-ordinary worlds and obtain knowledge and power in order to change the real world. So that was the underlying premise of his story. So I was totally fascinated by him. It's so much so that I called up the registrar during the summer of before college, and I said, sign me up for a cultural anthropology course. So that fall I would actually sit in cultural anthropology because I had some ideas back then when I was 18 that, hey, maybe I could go down to Central America and study with a shaman.
And so some years later, you actually did.
I actually did that many years later. 27 years later, because there was a little sidetrack there, which I'll tell you about. But after I had read those books and decided to learn more about it, and throughout the years, I have been continuing to learn about Carlos Castaneda, and I was also very interested in learning about University of California because it seemed like he had excellent teachers and that he learned a lot, and they were very open to what he was studying. So I did some research and I discovered that he had some excellent professors down there. One of them is Maria Gimbutas. She was an archaeologist, and she was one of the first ones who did matriarchal studies and also goddess studies. And she published, I don't know the name of the book, but she authored and published a book which in the 1970s really put goddess studies on the front page. And everybody, it was from the 1970s on that studying goddesses really came back into Western culture. Before then, it was really left to the archaeologists. But she popularized it, and I think also she influenced Carlos Castaneda in his later writings. Another professor who was there at the time, a man by the name of Carlo Ginzburg, who he studied witchcraft and magic, and he was able to tie the medieval practices of witchcraft and magic to shamanism. And I think, in my opinion, he is correct in his assumptions, and I think what we see with respect to folk magic, particularly in witchcraft, not the practitioners and not the ones who were persecuting the witches, but the actual practitioners of folk magic and witchcraft, their roots do go back to shamanism, and witchcraft and folk magic is shamanism through the lens of Western culture, through the Christian religion and through the society, the Western society that happens since the late antiquity up into the late modern period. So Carlo Ginzburg was also there, and I think was influential in teaching Carlos. And Carlos's Castaneda's was really more focused on sorcery rather than healing. And sorcery, from Carlos's perspective, was more about learning how to gain knowledge and use your power in order to combat other sorcerers, and it wasn't so much for healing. Modern neo-shamanism is much more focused on the healing aspects rather than the sorcery aspects. But Carlos, in this respect, was more old school with respect to shamanism, because shamanism is both the healing and the sorcery part, and in its indigenous forms, you can't really separate the two. Another excellent professor there was Johannes Wilbert.
So these are all professors that Castaneda.
Was present when I can't. I really don't have his course syllabus, but these were all professors that were there at the time, and he probably took courses from them. Wilbert was he went down to South America and studied tobacco shamanism, and tobacco has a very long and what's the word I'm looking for here? Important history of use in South America as a psychedelic hallucinogenic drug. So the West came, they took it and they turned it into a pleasure, something to entertain themselves. Cigarettes were not used like the way they were in South America. And in South America, they were considered a sacrament and a drug that helped them commune with the gods. So Johannes Wilbert was very important in bringing that out, and published a very important book on that topic. Another very important cultural anthropologist there at the time, and certainly would have taught Carlos, his name is Gerardo Reichel Damatov. And he went down to Colombia to study the Tucano Indians. And the Tucano Indians were used a number of different hallucinogenic drugs as snuffs, or they would smoke them or find other means of ingesting them. And their culture was totally based on the use of these drugs, their cosmology, their sexual practices, everything. And he published several books on these topics in the 60s and 70s, and is considered one of the he was considered one of the most prominent anthropologists of his time.
And so all of these professors that Castaneda encountered and learned from, he basically took their academic work and was able to sort of popularize it through his narrative.
Right, and through his relationship with Don Juan. There's also another interesting part about Carlos when he was down at UCLA. There were a number of students that later became very famous. One of them, Barbara Meyerhoff, published a book called The Peyote Hunt, which was about the Huichol Indians in central Mexico and their use of peyote. Peter First was another student there at the time, and he published books about hallucinogenic drugs cross-culturally and how they were used in the West and also in the native countries. He also published a couple books about Native American art and art from the Huichol Indians. But probably the most important and influential student there at the time was Michael Harner. So if you don't know who Michael Harner is, he wrote the book called The Way of the Shaman, and he...
Sort of the Alan Watts of shamanism.
Yes.
Right.
And, yes, he popularized shamanism in a way that even Carlos didn't, because he provided what he called core shamanic practices. So Harner's theory is if you looked across all the different shamanic practices across all these cultures, there were some core techniques that he pulled from these cultures and then taught them in his book, in workshops. And I think he still has a center that's very active today.
And so with shamanism, maybe to a certain extent, theosophy undergoes this too. We have this synthesis of the teachings in the West, and it is both a blessing, but then sometimes quote-unquote purists will say, well, you've taken the essence out of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Harner was and is still criticized for that today. That basically what he's teaching is not shamanism. It's a new age
best of
flavor of something he's calling shamanism.
Yeah.
I have used some of his techniques, and they do work, but I don't practice them any of them today.
And why is that?
It just doesn't fit with the direction that I'm going in right now.
Okay. Let's talk more about some of these other books.
Well, there's one other point I want to bring up.
There's
UCLA had another interesting asset that Carlos was able to use, and that was the library. So it had an excellent library. So why do I bring that up? Well, let me just say that whenever I get interested in something, I not only read the primary literature, I try to find all the secondary literature that I can. So back in 1980, there was very little secondary literature about Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda. In fact, the only ones that I could find were books by Richard DeMille. And Richard DeMille basically said in his books that Carlos was a fraud. And he very detailed analysis. He studied the flora and the fauna of the area in which Carlos said that he was. Didn't match up. He looked at the teachings of Carlos and discovered, well, gee, none of the native Indians that he's talking about know of these teachings. That didn't match up.
It's a red flag.
And I read these books, and I'm like, oh my God, he's right. He's a fraud.
Right.
So I was incredibly disappointed, and I eventually decided that, well, I guess this isn't for me, and I went a different direction. But I wanted to...
let me interrupt just for a second. That being said, what could still possibly be of value to somebody who wants to go into the Castaneda books, knowing perhaps that they're actually fiction?
Can we get back to that?
Yep.
Because I knew you were going to ask that question. Because why are you talking about it today, Pete, if he's a fraud?
Right. I mean, we can't edit.
But no, it's a good question. So, obviously I've continued to study Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda after I discovered this, because there's still a certain appeal there for me. And the appeal is if Carlos taught me anything, it's the importance of the trickster.
Sure.
And that the trickster can bring to light some things that you wouldn't normally understand or see if you didn't let the trickster into your life. Now, that's not always a positive thing, right? So it's funny, some people will say that there's not a duality, there's a trinity. There's good, evil, and the trickster. And the trickster will confound not only the good, but also the evil.
Yeah, that's right.
So if there's one thing I've learned from all this, is the importance of the trickster, and to look out for the trickster in your life. Because not only will you not get what you're expecting to get, but you also may learn something from it.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the fool in the tarot, right? I mean, if you don't take the leap, however foolish it may be, what are you here for?
Exactly.
Right.
So I wanted to just read a couple of quotes here from some of the students that were present when Carlos was at UCLA. This is actually Peter First, one of the students that I had mentioned. I have long been convinced that Carlos wrote his first book as an act of revenge against a professor who had given him a hard time, and he was going to show him up for the gullible fool that he thought he was. If you look at the first book, he says at the end, "I will never write about this again. I'm too scared." I think he was absolutely on the level with that, but then the money started rolling in. The first book, Teachings of Don Juan, he gave to the University of California Press. You don't give a book to an academic press with any expectations of royalties or fame. There were several professors who endorsed it as a new way of looking at the world. And the book came out in 1968. Then all of a sudden it caught on. Ballantine Books picked it up. When I read the original manuscript, I had some misgivings, which I mentioned to Barbara Meyerhoff. She replied, "Oh no, he's on the level. Maybe there's some graduate student hyperbole there, but I think this is all true."
Wow.
Michael Harner also has an interesting little quote here about Carlos. One of Carlos's most important contributions was introducing terms ordinary and non-ordinary reality, which remain immensely useful. The American anthropologist Robert Lurie had earlier used ordinary and extraordinary, but nothing quite works as well as ordinary and non-ordinary. Unfortunately, in later books, Carlos really didn't distinguish adequately between those terms anymore. The first two books were closer to shamanism and to what I consider to have been experiences with a psychedelic base. Later, Carlos shifted more into his own world. His later books have very little to do with shamanism and a lot to do with Carlos's own world, such as his construct of Toltec shamanism. Nobody knows who the Toltecs really were. It's simply an archaeological concept. The one individual, though, who did pick up on it right away was a gentleman by the name of G. Gordon Wasson, or Wasson, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but he was a banker who retired, was able to retire early and started to study native cultures. And he was also very interested in mushrooms and any types of mushrooms. But eventually he fell upon the hallucinogenic mushrooms, and he actually went to Central America, Mexico, and studied with a shaman by the name of Maria Sabina, a very famous shaman in the area, and she was a great healer. And she used psilocybin mushrooms. Now in the book,
Which book now?
The Teachings of Don Juan, okay. Carlos smokes these mushrooms. Gordon Wasson said, "You don't smoke the mushrooms, you eat them. You eat them raw, either fresh or dried." So right away he knew that Carlos, something was not quite right with Carlos. But I still think it's a great book. I think it is a great introduction to shamanism. And I would encourage people to read it. Just remember that it's fiction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Quite an introduction.
So the next book I wanted to talk about was The Dharma Bums. And this was a book that I discovered again when I was 18 in winter. I had moved away from shamanism and was looking for other things spiritual. And but I also enjoyed reading novels a great deal. And so I picked up The Dharma Bums. And
The Dharma Bums by
Jack Kerouac.
Jack Kerouac.
Thank you.
Okay.
And the book once again was a great inspiration to me, and I could say that this book changed my life because it was from that book that I started reading all types of Buddhism. And his book provides a number of resources. D.T. Suzuki, Han Shan, the 10 ox herding pictures, Gary Schneider. All these people are mentioned in one way or another in the book and provided me resources to start learning about Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism. And it was from that book that I actually went and practiced Soto Zen for many years.
Soto Zen. Is that the koan based?
They don't. This particular lineage did not use the koan so much. It was hardcore meditation. A lot of meditation. So this book, Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac is known for On the Road. That's his most famous book and the one he's remembered for. Which is kind of a shame because he wrote a lot of great books. And Jack was also known as the King of the Beats.
King of the Beats.
The Beatniks. Right. And in the 1950s, when I was young, he would travel a great deal. He would go from New York to Los Angeles to Mexico, back to New York, back to San Francisco. Actually, it was San Francisco, not Los Angeles. So New York, San Francisco, Mexico, and this was kind of his, I will call it his wheel of samsara.
Yeah.
He thought it was his wheel of dharma. He thought that he was getting enlightened, but unfortunately, his life turned out such that it was really more his wheel of samsara. Mm-hmm. But he was definitely on the path, and he was looking for enlightenment. And I say it was his wheel of samsara because he never was able to really solve, to come to terms with his alcoholism. Mm-hmm. And the difficulties that he had experienced in his life. And although he was seeking, he was never able to escape from the samsara he was in. Now, Jack was, he discovered Buddhism in 1953. And he practiced, we know that he practiced meditation, and he also wrote about Buddhism extensively in a number of his books up until 1961. That book's called The Big Sur, an excellent book, a book where Jack Kerouac struggles with trying to deal with his alcoholism. And Buddhism fails him in the book, and in the end he turns to Christianity. And actually he dies a Roman Catholic.
And he was raised Roman Catholic.
Yes, he was raised Roman Catholic. But from 1953 to 1961, he studied Buddhism and wrote about Buddhism. He created a book of Buddhist catechism called Some of the Dharma, which is not released till after his death. He wrote the description of the Golden Eternity, which is Gary Snyder, the poet and essayist, had asked them to write a Buddhist sutra. And so that is Jack's Buddhist Sutra. It's a great read, short, poetic read of his take on Buddhism. Jack also wrote a very long epic poem called the Mexico City Blues, which contains a lot of Buddhist imagery, specifically Mahayana imagery. And he infused Buddhism in books like Tristessa and Visions of Gerard. In those two books, in both books, they're focused on sorrow and suffering. In Tristessa, it's about, he falls in love with a woman who is a junkie, and his struggles with trying to get her to quit, and drawing on both Buddhist and Catholic teachings of suffering and sorrow in order to help himself cope with what he was feeling, as well as to help her. Visions of Gerard is a book, again, of loss, sorrow, and suffering. It's a book about his older brother who died at 9 from rheumatic fever. And the book is just a beautiful tale written from the perspective of Jack when he was his younger brother, 4 or 5 years old, and his visions and Gerard's visions when Gerard is slowly dying. So all of them very touching books. I can highly recommend them.
Jack Kerouac, I just to interrupt you, if you've not read him, I hope you try him, because he can write about, as Pete was saying, any heartbreaking issue under the sun. I think he does cover them all.
Yes, he does.
But with such incredible beauty, such incredible poignancy. For my money, he's as good a mystic poet as anybody who's ever written in English language.
Yeah, I think as good as Walt Whitman.
Blake, who he loved.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So, Jack wrote this book because he met Gary Snyder. And Gary was a poet and essayist who he had met in San Francisco. Jack met him in San Francisco and became enamored with him. And he actually saw Gary Snyder. In the book, he's called Jaffe Ryder. So I'll call him Jaffe from here on out.
That's in Dharma Bums, right?
Yeah, that's in Dharma Bums. He meets him, and he reminds him of Dean Moriarty. Now, Dean Moriarty is the hero. Some people would consider him an anti-hero in On the Road. And while Dean Moriarty, who in real life is a real character, a real person, Neal Cassady, and for people who don't know who Neal Cassady was, he was really Jack's muse for several years. And Jack wrote about Dean because he saw in Jack an existential freedom, a joy, and an ability to live that he never experienced before in himself or in anybody else that he'd met. And Dean/Neal just brought everything around him to life. And it was actually Neal Cassady who started Jack on the road and kept him on the road. And On the Road is about their travels from New York to San Francisco to Mexico, and what he learned from Neal Cassady during these trips. So Jaffe Ryder, in a sense, is like Dean Moriarty. He had that same type of ability to show Jack a new way to live in the world. And you have to remember that Jack is writing this book, Dharma Bums, in 1957, and it's of his experiences with Jaffe Ryder, Gary Snyder, in 1955 and 56. So we're talking, we're approaching the McCarthy era in the United States, where people's civil liberties were curtailed. The freedom of speech, freedom of press were under a great deal of scrutiny because of the communist threat, and a lot of people were wrongly accused of things that they weren't doing. So America was a lot different place then, and also, it was post-war. There was a great deal of materialism in America, and not a whole lot of freedoms unless you were a white male. Mm-hmm. And so the Beats reacted against this type of culture, and were trying to forge new ways to live in this time. And so he saw in Jaffe Ryder kind of, a Dean Moriarty, but a much more spiritual kind of freedom that Dean didn't really bring to the table. Gary was a poet, and he was learning to study Buddhism, and right before, during the book actually, Jaffe ends up going to Japan to study Buddhism. So Gary Snyder was very serious about his Buddhism, and Jack learned a lot from Gary. So the book is really about three mountain poets: Gary Snyder, Jack Kerouac, and Han Shan. And Gary shows Jack how to climb a mountain. And what Jack learns is not only how to climb a mountain, but also how to live closer to nature. And the 9th century Chinese poet Han Shan is also featured throughout the book. He was also a mountain monk. And actually, I brought a book. You have a book of poems of Han Shan in the library, and I would highly recommend that people check it out. But as it turns out, it's checked out right now. So I brought my own copy, and I just wanted to read a couple of poems from Han Shan because Han Shan was influential, not only Jack Kerouac, but also Gary Snyder, and really forms the spine of this book. They use Han Shan as a launching point to their mountain climbing and what they can learn about themselves, Buddhism, and nature by living in the mountains. So let me just read a couple of short poems from Han Shan so you can get a feel for how he writes. I reached Cold Mountain and all cares stopped. No idle thoughts remained in my head. Nothing to do. I write poems on rocks and trust the current like an unmoored boat. Cold Mountain owns a house with no partitions inside. 6 doors open left and right. From the hall he sees blue sky. Wherever he looks it's bare. The east wall greets the west. Nothing stands between them. No need for anyone's care. He makes a small fire when cold comes. Cooks plants when hunger arrives. He isn't like the old farmer enlarging his fields and sheds, creating nothing but hell-bound karma. Once begun, it never ends. Think this over well. Think and discover the key. So this poem really also highlights why Buddhism and the Beats were such influence in a materialistic 1950s America. And you can see how Han Shan influenced the thinking of, which, by the way, he dedicated. Jack Kerouac dedicated to Han Shan.
I didn't know that. And it seems, just from what you've read there too, that Kerouac's whole his themes and the way he lived his life also had a certain, like a Taoist Buddhist influence in that.
Yes.
Right? And sort of catching the current, catching the flow, hopefully in a positive way.
Yeah, the Cold Mountain poems are really magnificent.
Mm-hmm.
And you can really see the Chinese Buddhist influence in American Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so that's what I really liked about it. So let me just read just a couple quick passages.